one of my own pieces called Music Stands as a kind of introduction to how I like to work with it, and then I'll use the works of several others as examples of different kind of practices with feedback. And I will only focus on feedback using microphones and loudspeakers, so acoustic feedback, and evidently some of that is then processed again in more digital ways.
Ooh, testing sound.
We can just do it during.
There's that audio plug, right? That might just work.
No, but I go through HDMI, so it should.
Okay. Should.
I don't have that. Do I have volume controls?
Screen, maybe.
Let's start soft. If I do it too quickly, it doesn't work. No, I just have to go.
It's working.
Okay. So after having played this piece, I will give you some of my ideas and thoughts on why and when I use feedback in a performance. What you just heard was Music Stands, performance I developed in 2011, but it's always a bit, it's feedback, so it's alive in the sense that these were the first times I performed it with these music stands, which does make a bit of a difference than other music stands, but in general it's more or less the same performance since around 10 years. I usually tune it a bit longer, the system, so I'm sure that everything is in balance, and when I do it like this it's more exciting for me because I just don't, I haven't done a run through before you came in. I didn't do a full run through, so then it always reacts a bit differently, so I have to be more active and realizing, what's gonna happen. For me, feedback is always a whole system, instrument, environment, and I think it's the same for you. But I saw with the presentations yesterday that it's always including every, like there are many different aspects in the feedback. The space is included, the digital part, which I think is quite, well, I would say it's quite a recent development, that taking also the digital part, taking the computer into account as a valuable addition and not just as a limiter, as we see in many of the works in the 60s and 70s of the early feedback works, not computers of course, but the analog equipment added was like, it's just a small limiter, which is added, or even though I think some of the classical feedback works were just performed with the limiter was the equipment, which you can do with a guitar amplifier, but with these kind of amplifiers and these kind of small loudspeakers, they die. The second important aspect for me is that feedback is always tuned between tuning fork and diaphragm. That's a metaphor, and actually not only a metaphor, but also the practical starting points of 19th century science in thinking how to reproduce sound, how to synthesize sounds, are the tuning forks. When we think of the Helmholtz, his device which uses tuning forks, which to reproduce vocal sounds, to reproduce vowels, and then the diaphragm, which we see developed in, for example, of course, the phone, the different phone patents in the 19th century. And both are, of course, aiming at the same reproduce sounds, which we know already, especially the voice was very important to reproduce, evidently because that can be easily used for communication. And for me, these two starting points are the tuning fork, which can only deliver one pitch, which is made that it's impossible to play anything else than the one pitch it can do, over years even, which is quite nice. And the diaphragm, which is the opposite, where you have to, ideally the ideal diaphragm is able to reproduce all frequencies, every possible frequency which we can hear at least. So that and in between these two, I think most of that's the choice we have, right? For a feedback system, how are we going to tune it? What should it make? Should it make all possible frequencies, or should it make just one? And I'll show you now different works also where I will sometimes refer to like, this is really a tuning fork work, or oh, this is really diaphragm going on. It's a bit in between. Like I'm very sure certain sounds can happen, but I'm also very sure that I will be surprised during the performance. So it's always going back and forth. First of all, I will look at 4 different aspects. The first one is sound, because one of the things I thought about when I thought about coming to this meeting was like, oh, that's nice, feedback conference. And I was also thinking like, so what is it, feedback? And for me, the first thing I thought of was a sound. It's a sound. We recognize it as it's also right. Evidently, it's also biological processes are based on feedback. There are a lot of engineering which is based on feedback. But for me, coming from sound, coming from music, feedback is a sound. First of all, and then I thought, is it recognizable? And what would be really typical feedback sound? So I brought an example by Kusum Normal, who is I should take away that. So you can read it. A performance of hers. She's, I think she grew up in Turkey, but she's based in Australia for a long time already. And she really sees feedback as her co-performer, but it's also her performer, so to say, with whom she really goes into a kind of, well, it's really a duet where both are screaming, literally, for being the loudest and being with most energy, etc. So we will look at a short excerpt of one of her performances, and I think this is a very open feedback system, much more open than any of the systems I think we have talked about till now, because it's really like feedback in the simplest sense. There's a microphone, there's huge loudspeakers, and there's one performer who's going to perform with it. I do it over this. Some of the videos I have like real videos, but some of them I stream. So it might be that if the internet is not on its high speed, that we have some problems. But I hope it will work. So she's clearly tuning the system here with guitar amplifiers, where you can tune, of course. And then she goes into a dialogue, trying to jump a bit more. Oh, yeah, that's exactly system, and she keeps it quite open. But we also hear one of the advantages of an open feedback system is that it's very reactive, so it's gonna react on all the sounds she makes. It's going to take over her screams, but it's stopping when she screams, etc. So we have a clear something which is very, I think, of feedback sound. A very clear characteristic is that it's so reactive, and that we hear always it comes into being and it stops again, it comes into being, which I think is much more a characteristic than the sound itself, although we might all recognize it, but we recognize it especially because it changes, because it's in action. To show you a completely different example, which I think is very different from what Kusum Normal is doing. This is Viola Yip, and it's Lazy Studies, this performance. She performs with, this is a turning, Lazy Susan it's apparently called, but I didn't know a Lazy Susan until I got to know her work. But I think you use it on when you have a dinner, and then you turn it around. You seem all to know this. Okay. Anyway, so, and there's this, again, it's the same setup, just that the loudspeakers are much smaller. But I think the microphone is the same. And this is how it sounds when Viola plays, with also, again, a very open system. There are 3 different loudspeakers, but there's not much processing happening. So also here we see some tuning on stage. I'll jump a bit later when we see her playing with it. So a different way of making a feedback system, in the sense that the material is much smaller, and also playing it in a different way. But I think these 2 performances show for me what a lot of people like about playing with raw feedback. It's not necessarily a recognizable sound. Like, it's not like I'm going to play the violin and everybody says, oh yeah, I know that's that range, and But there, and especially in some of the later performances we are gonna look at today, will be even more like, is this really still feedback? Would you have recognized? I sometimes listen to it and then I think, would I have recognized that it is feedback, or am I even sure that it is feedback or not? So it's not necessarily recognizable, but it is a sound which definitely we identify as electronically sounding, because often it's just resonating on a few frequencies, so it has something very much in common with sine waves, and it can be modified by physical interaction, which we don't have with many sounds, right? So it's very much on top of it's in your hands, and you can change it easily. So, and the other part is the material becomes audible. So the material of working with becomes audible. That's why she put some cardboard on top of the loudspeaker, and it will change the pitch, it will change it might change the spectrum a bit, etc. So in that way, it feels, I think, closer for many musicians to an instrument than many electronic sounds. As Robert Ashley said, even that the only real electronic sound is feedback. That's really the core of electronics. And what is different is, of course, that we don't have to map anything. We don't have to map a fader. We can just start to work with a very simple setup where everybody get it. Like, oh, when I move the microphone, it changes, which makes feedback also very accessible sounds. Also for people who come from outside of electronics, it's like something you can understand immediately. It's like I think after amplification and feedback is, of course, nothing more than a more extreme form of amplification, not more extreme only because we need louder volumes, but also because it's gonna, even more than amplification, it's gonna filter out certain sounds, and because of filtering out others, some sounds, other frequencies will be resonating more. An example of someone who works with that, and I think what is quite typical for many of the feedback performers, is Leslie Flanagan. She works with feedback instruments, and what is typical for me about her performances is that she has not a music background. She comes from making sculptures. She has a fine art background, and she makes her own feedback instruments. And this is she started with a very simple, what she called speaker synth. And here we see it, and I think it's very typical for what I would say simple feedback work is often doing, taking different kind of loudspeakers. In her case, she even uses loudspeakers she's found on the street, and she uses piezo ceramic discs. And the nice things about these piezo ceramic discs are, of course, that they have a very strong material part already, so we know that they're going to filter out sounds. They're already a resonating system. They have a lot of tuning fork quality for a diaphragm system. Like you're sure that they are going to resonate at certain frequencies, and they will leave out others. Also, it's quite, normally you use them as contact microphones, so you have to really place them quite close to the membrane to get feedback at all. I'll quickly play. This is an early version instrument, which I don't know if she would be so happy that I present this instrument, because it's an early version, but what I like about it is that you see that she touches the membrane, she touches the diaphragm of the loudspeaker, so that, which makes it really, shows how accessible feedback is as a sound, as a process, that you can touch it, which normally, right, you don't encourage people when they do studio work, oh, let's all touch the membrane. of hers, where just to show you how she performs with it live, and that it's she made several modules, and she works with a loop station and used her own voice also. So she literally shares the microphone with the feedback instruments. And if we then look at the sound of feedback in the performance music stands, I try to build up the sound, and it's very much for me to performance on well, first of all, doing an action we know, of course, of music. So it's starting with the sound of that action, with a non-amplified action of the music stand unfolding, amplifying that, and then I use a lot of, how do you say, processing going on, which I assume many of you heard that, but which is not necessarily to be heard by the general public. So if you, for example, that when I touch at some point when I unfold the music stands, the sound is transposed, so it's the amplification is transposed, because I want a richer sound from the music stands than what they are, because in fact they are not that, it's not such a big change, but for me it makes them much more musical in the sense that they get a sound where the small changes in sound seems like, oh, every click you make is a different click, whereas they would sound more similar, which actually the first one is not, there's no transposition at all, but the second one, when you've heard it already once, there are small changes, so there's the transposed amplified sound, which takes for me out of the music stands, there it starts with the how could they sound, which is an important part of my work, is going on not only this is how it sounds, but also how could they sound, what would happen if. That's also why the samples come, because then there's a kind of, okay, yeah, the sound starts to stay, so to say. So there are samples. I don't know, use a delay, but you heard perhaps on some, I do like this click, and then there's a, and it's like the sound stays, and I don't want a delay, because then you would probably hear like, oh, there's a delay, you would hear an exact replica, and we are very good in recognizing that. So I use some samples I made before, and I just trigger them as a kind of, slowly they start to sound on their own. And that's then the next step is then the feedback, which is done when I put a loudspeaker on the music stand, which is meant as a sound which the music stand makes, where I can step back and I can start to listen how do they sound at different points, because of the music stand has a, so the feedback sound changes depending on how high and how low the music stand is, how much metal there is in between the contact microphone and the loudspeaker. And since the loudspeaker is magnetic, of course, because that's how it's built with a big magnet, I can just put it on the music stand. And also with the feedback, there's also some processing going on that I know that if I take away the loudspeaker for 3 seconds and the microphone doesn't get, the piezo-ceramic element doesn't get any signal for 3 seconds, it's gonna switch the preset. There's again, it's a slight preset, it's just sometimes adding some, like you heard already, like it's not a feedback, but a slowly changing feedback often. So often there's a very small transposition, so I know the feedback is always going to go back and forward between, oh yeah, I have to transpose, so I go up, but then it's flipping back to what the material says. So I like these kind of dialogues between digital processing and happening here, so it becomes more unstable. So that's what changes every time I take this away and I put it back. And then at the end, at some point, they start to get connected. Like I have it's very simple. There's just the microphone of this one goes to the loudspeaker of this one, and the microphone of this one goes to the loudspeaker of that one. So then they're very connected, and the feedback is not anymore directly, but in 2-second loop. So what is played here is going there. So they're kind of becoming a system. Sonically, it's a distortion of the feedback. It's just like the feedback becomes more complex because it has time to really stay in the instrument, so to say, and go to the other one. And then it becomes at the end, they are not only making stable sounds, so to say, or one sonic, but they can evolve. You might hear. I let it. I don't always leave it sounding for such a long time, but I thought this is a feedback audience, so I leave it. I leave it long. I want to hear what they do. When I test it, I often leave it for 5 or 10 minutes to see, like, okay, how is it evolving, and the better they start to react on each other, the better the system is installed. So, and if they don't react well, then I have some. It actuates it. If I do not tune it right, it would die. And if it can never explode, but it can happen that it's too loud and it's not reactive enough anymore. So that's a bit what I try to. So I try to develop the feedback sounds from my interactions with the music stands, and the whole performance is in fact just building up feedback. It's not let me say and that is sonically speaking. Then another part which I think, except the sound of feedback, what is very important is the setup. And we see many feedback setups which are very visual oriented as well. If we think already of pendulum music by Steve Reich, I think that's a classical example where you see the feedback. This is a piece by Adam De Santa, Pirouette, 2015, where you see the feedback. This is a very strong tuning fork, very strong orientated to tuning fork piece, because have a short listen. Yeah, this is another work which is in the same video, but we will see the first work. capabilities to turn this off are apparently not. I thought it always reacted to a command K, but apparently I might have changed it. Anyway, so what we saw here was it's a feedback which is so tuned that he can, I think it's a Tchaikovsky melody of a ballet, so I don't recognize it immediately, but my Tchaikovsky knowledge might be not enough to be able to recognize that immediately, but what I do recognize is that there's a melody and you can repeat it all the time because the feedback is tuned so much to just one resonator. And it's a completely different character, I think, if you think of Kusum Normoil, what's happening with the feedback. And the only, I think as an audience member, the indicator, this is feedback, it might be a bit the sound, but hey, you might do that also with all kind of simple filtering techniques. So it's much more the image of having the microphone that close to the loudspeaker where you would think, like, oh, we know this because nowadays I think that kind of knowledge, you don't hold the microphone too close to the loudspeaker. Although most people who are not used to it, they take the microphone away from their mouth, whereas you should do the opposite. Someone else who also uses feedback, I think, as a setup, but where you do not see it, because that exists also, so that was in my search of, so what is specific of feedback? I was like, well, it's not necessarily sound, because we have heard many different sounds. Even if you could say there's some pitched sound going on, but there's also a lot of, and we will hear some of that later on, so there's also a lot of noise sound going on. You could also say there are no short sounds, but later on we will hear also some feedbacking with short sounds and rhythmic sound. With setups, I think it's the same. There's some setups where it's very clear that there's feedback going on. When you see, for me during a performance of Tomoko Sauvage, it's not the setup because it's our hydrophones and it's feedbacking with a PA system. Apparently, I asked her, so I imagine she's not lying, but she's just controlling the feedback. That's also why this picture is quite typical for her. She's controlling the feedback just with the mixing desk, and that's it. That's how she feedbacks the different balls and their hydrophones in there. Here you see, and there are several control pedals because feedback is for her, as for many people, the sound is her, the material. This is not an interactive performance where, well, it is. She's playing the feedback quite a lot actually with the water, but it's I would say that there are different approaches also in how you approach feedback as just being something you sample, like we also saw with Leslie Flanagan, or something where you say, no, this is really the system, or it kind of influences the form, the way I compose or I improvise, or it really becomes part of my instrument as a way of playing. So we listen a bit to this. So we see here, I think, quite clearly how she plays the feedback with the water going in the hand, and so it's clear she plays the water, but it's not necessarily clear feedback setup as we saw in Adam Basanta or many other feedback pieces. About my own setup in music stands, it starts with the everyday action, then I start with the instrumental coloring, what I told you, not only actually the instrumental coloring is for me as a performer, I'm not only thinking of it as changing the sound a bit, like adding some transposition, so it becomes more what I just called musical. But also, I try to play differently. It suddenly becomes something, oh yeah, there's this click, and then there are movements coming which are not anymore related to this everyday action of building it up, but more of what is instrumental playing, I would say. So it's colored by instrumental practice. Then it becomes a real instrument when it can play by itself. So I could try to start to play a melody, which would not work, of course. But well, in fact, if I would just use a system as Adam Basanta, I could play a melody with the loudspeakers then. And then at the end, it goes into a system where it starts to respond on itself, and I don't have to touch it anymore. It's clear, like it's going to go on for, well, if I've tuned it well, it should go on forever, but I evidently never tried that. But as many feedback systems, as you know them also, they just would go on, and they would sound with pendulum music, right? You could do the same. I always think it's a pity they turn it off. It should be left on, and then audience should go, and you should come back after a day and look, how does it sound? Is it different? With pendulum music, because I think it's and then you should just leave it there till the next performance, and then someone pendles in again. Then the third element, which I like a lot about feedback, I think this is the one and I think you too, with the instruments, is that it's the interaction you have with feedback. What we had yesterday also already a lot. It's this idea that it reacts. It's open to react. So what Adam Basanta and that's not a critique of his work. That's just what is in this. What he's not after in this installation is that it's gonna react differently than you think it's reacting. So there's always quite a lot of diaphragm going on in that. This is a piece by Yoon Lee, and for 2 megaphones and feedback, and I think it's a nice example of, again, this is also a very super simple setup, even simpler than what we had till now, I think, because the megaphone, you can just go to a shop, buy it, and then you can do this piece. This happens 3 times during the piece. It's a very performative piece, and I show this right now. I feel with it, I should go forwards because it's when does the sound start? But evidently, that's part of the whole setup of this piece is the silence before the feedback, and also that the setup is really a part of the feedback of what is going to happen, and especially when you have heard it once, that you know already, like, oh, now I know when is it going to happen? What is it? How is it? And they stop. It's a very simple piece. They stop when the feedback is not there anymore. This is the score, and I'm not going to show you. This is a piece of mine where I worked with the setup, and well, actually it was a long process, so I can now say easily, like, oh yeah, I just use 3 boards and 3 microphones and 1 loudspeaker. But it was my first piece with feedback, and it was also the first time working with feedback, so I learned a lot on how to deal with feedback, how to make it as to how to make it interactive, because that was the main goal, was to play the feedback. And what I didn't realize at that time, that feedback is very responsive if you move this, or if you have a resonator in between, like a tube or anything, or a musical instrument. But if you have the other way around, damping, if you're doing feedback in the space, it's not so responsive, because you really have to do a lot. So these shields, as you see them here, they're not so big. They're big for getting them in a train and going to perform somewhere, but otherwise they're quite small for changing a space. But it is reactive, and it took me quite a while to find out what I had to do to make it reactive. And I made a score then where you can, so that we could perform the piece, because one of the things I found out with this reactiveness, I found out it's reactive, it's not possible, it's very open, it's very much diaphragm in a certain way. So if we just run around with these shields, we will have sound changes, but it is really not, it are minimal changes often, and then, oh no, now it changed like this here, but this afternoon, yeah, the temperature is probably a bit higher, we don't know. So we had all the, and then you went to another concert. So one of the things I decided with this piece, it has to be very clear in the movement, and the movements are completely fixed. What is not fixed is the time. So the time is when the feedback has changed, or sometimes when, so you have to listen like, okay, when the feedback has changed, then you can do the next step, and then you wait till the system finds its calibration again. So it's kind of, it's giving some movement in the system, and then putting them down, the shields, and listening till it found its calibration again. One of the system itself is also, it's listening, and it's listening to pitch changes, which is in feedback. You probably know P-Soup by Nicholas Collins, where it's listening to volume changes. And when I developed this piece, I did it together with Paul Krane. He made at the same time his feedback piece, which we will look at it at the end, tubes. And he did that he did it with resonating tubes and with volume. And volume, it's much easier. There are more changes in volume, or more, like volume stays one scale. Like you have soft and loud sounds, right? That's volume. But frequency, you couldn't predict like, oh, we will have, if we do this for the low sounds, and this for the middle sounds, and this for the high sounds, then you went to another room, and it was like, oh, in this room, the low sounds are actually pretty. So I found out at some point, I have to make this relative. And the relativeness I made was then when the sound changes. If the pitch changes, there's a slight change also in how the sound, for example, again, if there is some kind of, how the sound is filtered a bit. So there are changes as soon as the system hears like, oh, the pitch has changed, then it knows, because that's the way also to detect that one of the shields has moved, is because the pitch of the feedback changed. There's one thing. The other thing, which has nothing to do with feedback, but it's very practical to change the feedback setup and to change the sound, is that there is a 18,000 hertz signal going from the loudspeaker, and it's caught by the microphone, and the player in the middle does can, and you will see it in the video, suddenly the sound changed a lot. And that's not because of the feedback suddenly by one opening up. So that's my whole, there's my, I want to do something where this is how I imagine it would change, thing coming in. And that the moment that happened, the moment the microphone gets the 18,000 hertz signal, the pad just does a change in how, for example, I add, there's some ring modulation, you will hear it like, ring modulation added to the feedback sound, so it's always the processing of the feedback sound, but it's like, well, it's like I would say the knob on an instrument where you, but then in that case it's not a knob, but it's just being able to shove it. And so every time you see the microphone, you see the loudspeaker, that's the moment the preset is changed. But in the beginning, we will see now, first part of the beginning, there are no changes. It's just listening of, did the pitch change or not. And evidently it's very, you have to set it up well and that everything, it can be quite responsive and it can be not so responsive when you don't set it up well and you don't have all the volumes well. And well, so the spaces most time are not, I guess I've never done it in a very resonating space. I guess there it would be perhaps a bit different, but otherwise the space is not that much influencing that it's not that well, yes it is actually, but one of the things what is not so much influence is that the microphones and the loudspeaker, there's not so much space in between them. There's just 3 meters, because otherwise there's no way, if the space is influencing too much, there's no way I can do anything with the shields. And I have, if it's 5 meters apart, then it's over. There's just no way to the sound waves will just travel past the shields. This is the piece Paul Kahn did at the same time. So he used resonators and volume, and it's a super complex piece to play, I think. It's also a very nice piece because it's very responsive, and there are 5 layers of volumes. So depending on the volume you have, it's going to process differently. And this is a piece where you also will hear many not so classical feedback sounds, or you recognize that they are there. But when it starts, when you're in front of the loudspeakers and the microphones, we damp the sound, and then when you step apart is just a small grain of feedback coming through high because it's highly filtered. It's a very responsive system, but it's also quite difficult to set it up like that. It's also like to have it really silent when you're in front of the microphone. The nice thing is that you also really learn to play it. So you learn to I have to be a bit more in front of the microphone, and especially this part, what we do here, this called the musician's part, so to say, is playing with the tube. It's very responsive because it reacts here again on the loudness of what you do with resonating the tube. And there's a lot of granular synthesis going on, and that's how it sounds. System in the sense that it's really you need to make the gestures with the resonators to achieve a certain state, but you can immediately take them away and then it's immediately back to zero again. Evidently you have to exercise it to also recognize, oh, I'm there now, and if I do a bit more, if I close it a bit more, it's gonna resonate more, and then it's gonna go to the next, like you heard the low melody, the part of this is something where when I rehearsed this piece with Paul, he's like, oh yeah, can you do the low melody a bit around there? And I was like, yes. I can try to, can it come a bit later? I'm like, yeah, I didn't spend that much time with the system as you did, so, but it is possible. And one of the very nice things, and I hadn't realized it the first time I played it, but we played it again in 2019, and then I realized you can really feel the air in the tube. So it's really a very physical piece as well. Well, we'll skip the when you get longer tubes and you can connect them, then it also gets lower. Fourth element of what when we have the sound, the setup, and the interaction, and the last is of course the unforeseen, unforheard, which is a part of the interaction in a way, but it's also a part of not interacting, because that's what we get as a reaction from the system, and what makes it, what makes us, I think, perform also differently. When you perform with a feedback system, you know that many things might happen, or that just a small change might suddenly have it develop in a different way. So I had one piece where it's called Empty Chess, And it's not at all a feedback piece, because there are a lot of different things happening in it, but at the end I realized one of the if I want a kind of an end where once again where the system starts to talk, to resonate, to do their own thing, the best solution might be feedback. So it ends with a feedback sequence, and that's the last thing I would like to show you for today also.
Very mundane things in service of the feedback, that kind of thing. So the feedback is kind of there, and there's these sort of servants around the feedback, or not always. This felt like a slightly different relationship. But is that a really conscious thing to have these kind of very normal situations around this? I mean, it was talked about as a very otherworldly thing yesterday. Was that the term? I can't remember what it was called. But and it's an odd contrast maybe. But anyway, is that something that plays into your thinking at all?
In my work, definitely, yes, because I, without thinking about feedback, because then feedback is just one of the tools I use in the end. So also in my work without feedback, I like to do normal things, so to say, and to evidently I'm never doing them normally. Like this piece with the chairs, for me it's a super difficult performance piece to behave normally. And it's also not really normally, because I mean, no, so in a way it's not normal. People also tell me afterwards, like, you're super serious, and I'm like, yeah, it's a serious piece. So my behavior, or I also have a piece where I eat an apple, and there also my behavior is very much oriented to what is sounding, but I try to keep it not as if related to what is sounding. So it evidently also in the chair piece, like every movement of the chairs is for example, in the beginning I put the chairs on stage, but at that moment they're recording my sound, and then I put them down, and then they start to play the sound. And evidently I'm aware, oh, now they're recording, and I play with that. I do shorter, like, okay, this is a short loop, okay. Now I need it a bit longer, and then so the difficulty then is oh, okay, I need a bit longer, but the chair also has the stage is not long enough for how much sound I want. So that are the difficulties which I hope no one on stage in the audience really sees anyway. But so yes, but that's I would say it's not necessarily. I don't think it has to be an aspect of feedback. I agree with you. Many of the works I showed here are into that Yeah, although I think that are also to work like what Leslie Flanagan or Tomoko Sauvage is doing. That's really stage work in the sense that they're really playing an instrument. And also Adam Basanta, I don't think he does this anymore. He did a lot of feedback, like for 2 years. He did a lot of feedback, and then he went away from it. But he also does. He has a performance where he does things and it's like a set. It's really an improvisation set and he could also improvise with that. Also, Tomoko Savage is playing with other people, so that's much more instrumental. And my stuff, it's never. I can't improvise. And this is also not. This is really not an improvisation because it's much too diaphragm-like, right? I mean, in the sense that you put something on it, and I really have no idea what it. I think someone could improvise with it.
Yeah.
So people could improvise with it and react on it, but this thing is very not so reacting on. Like I can't. I really don't know how it's gonna sound from when I put it. I have like might sound different. The second one was a bit. I was like, I didn't tune you. So well today. So it was less responsive than the first one, and then it's. But yeah, that's.
This behavior you're talking about, for me, it's really related to an aesthetic which is really also coherent with the analog way you use feedback, and I think to Fluxus in terms of kind of golden age of post-phenomenology of art. So I'm an artist, my act is an artistic act, and in this case, for example, it will have to do with sound and with feedback. So I understand also all your presentation as something really coherent in the vision of trying to give a definition to what is feedback in terms of the chain and the blockchain. I mean, something which happens will provoke a reaction. This reaction will provoke a proposition, and so on. And I feel you give your place in that chain. You are a piece of a system. Okay? And this is purely an analog scheme, which is really coherent with Fluxus time. And so I think your presentation is very interesting also in a way of theory and giving a kind of how do you say that? Prendre du recul when you take delay this time, so you can look at the past and say from the origin. I give a definition now of something that born with Luigi Russolo and till the beginning of digital time, in which we are totally now. So I really thank you to give this as a legacy of a time past, even if it can have meanings to still continue this point of view on the world from an analog chain. But my question is also kind of response of the question you had for me yesterday. And this morning I woke up and was wondering. I said, now I understand why she asked me this about what is the amount part of analog and digital in the process. And I understood this morning before coming why you asked me that question, because I think it's important for you to give a definition of the art. So I was wondering, in this moment we are sharing since yesterday, and thank you very much for that moment, because it's really strong. What let us met here is feedback. How to make music or art with feedback. And I was thinking of that. We could, for example, make a meeting about how could we make pies with apples, for example. So how could we make pies with apples?
Okay.
So everybody can share. So I do like this, I do like this. Is this a pie or not? But I don't know, maybe. But the question, I think so thank you Chris and Dan for that, because making music with feedback is can you recipe. What is the purpose hidden behind this, behind our practice? And I was wondering, in a chain, like in a biological chain, if an object is missing, there is an error in the chain. You can check that in biology, for example. And it's so difficult to make something with feedback and to live inside this chain to make something and to keep the feedback, or to not be submerged by it. So if you don't, if you die, the feedback will die. So what I was thinking is, what is the hidden subject of feedback behind the definition you gave us? Philosophically.
Philosophically, I don't think I'm also not sure. Do you mean the blockchain? Do you mean is that a metaphor, right?
No, I just mean like a chain. A chain made.
Yeah, but as a metaphor, not as analog, not a real analog.
Just the physical
Because there's no
principle of a blockchain is a chain of events, and one exists because it was stimulated by another one, and each one be stimulated before the previous
Yeah,
one.
I understand that, but what do you mean with the difference with analog and digital? Not literally analog and digital.
The difference.
I know what the difference is. My question is, what do you said you are doing analog work, and my question is, you don't mean literally analog, like.
No.
So what?
Use a computer. That's not the problem. But I mean, it's a way of making things. It's a way of making things. Of believing that each element, it's like you don't have to. You have to keep the integrity of the chain.
Okay, yeah, I think I can kind of get what you.
I mean, I know it has to be with this, no? If you, no?
Are you talking about the active doing? What's the philosophy behind the
Yeah.
active doing in the chair one? Is that what you're trying to
Yes, I wanted to contextualize my question to try to be understandable, but maybe I'm not. So that's all right.
I think you're talking about the philosophy behind ACT as a thing with the feedback.
Yeah, on the question of making music with feedback, even if we are, whatever references we are shaped, finally, what is the hidden subject?
Yeah.
Or what is the hidden purpose?
Yeah, the hidden meaning.
The hidden meaning behind making music with feedback for you.
okay, yeah. Then I get it. It really depends on the piece, because this is a very much it's a quite a process piece, not necessarily a process in what is happening technically, because there are quite some things which are not. I mean, then I think pendulum music is really an example of a process piece where you put something into working and then it's going to work. Here, there's a lot happening beyond the screens, which I'm not interested in. I tell you, but I'm not necessarily interested in telling that as during the piece. That's also not. So the piece is much more on actually how we have an act of doing something, and what tells what is there. So for me, the form, what they become, and how they start to sound then, and that I start to listen to them. That's very important for me, that when I have put a loudspeaker there, that I listen to it, and I also have to listen to it, because it's gonna be a sound I don't know. So that's the important part why I use feedback. So I listen to it, and then I decide, okay, and how do you sound when I put it there? So it's getting a more. It's looking for a humanizing object, of course, without ever really getting them into a humanized version, but having this looking at how we do humanize nearly everything, because it's nearly not our whole perception system is made to humanize. That's kind of unavoidable. To humanize it, to make things out of them where we're nearly there, but we aren't, of course. And I like to do that with material we know, because then we can identify with it, or we have a relationship with it. So that's, I think, what I do. Is that answer?
Okay. No, that's your answer. I understand. It's visible. It's viewable.
I love your work, and I see it as some kind of like radical act of subversion against classical hierarchies, and it just took me back to that first day when you were told in a little orchestra to put your music stand out and you can't do it, and it was just fabulous, and I love that feeling of playfulness. And then with the chairs again, I love that idea that even last night, the people that put the chairs out, the caretakers, and I love your work. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for that presentation. It's great. It's a lot of artists I hadn't seen before. Really interesting work. My question really is, you said this to me after the concert, or when we were talking at some point, when you said today in the presentation that you're not an improviser. And for me, I watch your work, and it looks like you're listening, you're paying attention, you're adapting, you're responding in a musical way. And so why, for me, that's improvisation. So why do you not see yourself as an improviser?
Oh yeah. This is of course a definition question more than where does improvisation start and where does composition end. I am, if you would see this, if you would see this piece 10 times, then you would see 10 times more or less the same things happen. But so so I'm not a free improviser. But perhaps perhaps you're right, that I'm much closer to someone playing a jazz standard, which I have never thought of.
You're definitely improvising on something, but you always are, right? Whether that's a social dynamic, whether there's always, there's no free improvisation.
No, there's no free improvisation. Because here I also know that you need slightly different levels for the beginning for amplifying the music stand. It's a different signal chain in my max patch when it starts to feedback. So I need to wait for that to happen. And in many of my pieces I have if I do this 3 times, then that and that. But here it's just a fade in. So I just know at some point, it gets a bit softer, so I have to get the loudspeaker. So there the improvisation element is really completely not happening. But you're right that I know now that's the couplet and now it's that's the refrain. So unfortunately, I think I'm doing jazz standard.
Yes. And very well as well.
Very well.
Yeah.
If I may respond to that, I think there's this really annoying sort of fallacy of thinking that composition is one thing and improvisation is another thing, and that there's this sort of chasm in between. I think of composition and improvisation always as a spectrum, and every piece lands somewhere in that spectrum. The extremes don't exist. And I think something that I notice in most of the work that I've seen is that there's this, our practices are very often concerned with the development of instruments, with the development of form, with the development of practice, like the performance practice, and all of these things are completely enmeshed. Like it's so impossible to sort of say like, oh yeah, well that is purely a performative action, and that has nothing to do with my compositional idea of the construction of my instrument or whatever. Or hey, now I'm constructing the instrument, and that has nothing to do with any sort of preconceptions about musical form or gestural interactions. It's one block, it's one thing, and a lot of musical language is about the separation of all of these things into different humans, like the human that performs the instrument, the luthier that makes the instrument, the composer that thinks about the form that's created. And I think those divisions for a lot of our practices here just don't make any sense. This is why you get these weird discussions about, oh yeah, well I'm actually, it's like, yeah, all of the above.
Yes, although I do think there are some I'm totally with you. Although I do think there's some difference in if you want to create an instrument and you have to be able to improvise with it, then it has to be flexible, reacting. This is super not flexible in the sense that there's just this, and I could start to work on it and say, okay, now 2 months time to make an instrument out of it, which is so, but then it would be really quite different, I think.
Yeah, but then again, it's like what you want and what you make, and it's all sort of this blob moving in a direction.
Yeah, it's very fluid.
Sorry.
Well, every now and then, when thinking about feedback pieces and the range of work that there is, and your talk covered that really interestingly and beautifully, and as Paul said, introduced me to some artists I didn't really before finding out more about. Some of the sort of discussions that were alive around surrealism in the 1930s and around, say, the writings of Walter Benjamin, about the fate of craft objects under capitalism come to my mind. So famously, Benjamin wrote in the work of Art and the Age of Mechanical Reproduction that the craft work has lost its aura through mass reproduction. And that potentially has there could be a dialectical liberation in that. But equally, there's other pieces of work by him and by others where especially writing about the surrealist concern with the outmoded and with objects which are modern but already out of date, or things which are recently out of date and their enduring power. And there's often a view in this sort of set of writing of the object reaching out to you just as much like the aura of the craft object, but it also things which potentials in the trash of capitalism too. But objects reaching out of you just as you're investing in them. And I wonder whether there's a sense in which quite a bit of the feedback work that you've discussed, including your own, has this sort of sense of a sort of re-enchantment of the relationship between humans and objects. Or re-enchantment of the objects become alive and reach out, and we can reach into them in a way which conventionally seen commodities don't encourage.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a big part of my work, is this reaching out by and the way probably I also develop. Although I don't see my aesthetics as a choice, but it would be that would be easy if I could choose. I would actually, I think I would make 8-channel fantastic works for electronics, or using or 16-channel ambisonics, whatever. So it's not like. Yes, I think it's a research on how does it sound, and my research is it's always all the pieces. Also the chair piece, for example, it starts with a lot of different things, and then I'm gonna do this, and it's always reduced. So until I found like, oh, this is what the work is about. It's just on the 2 music stands being there and being a reduced person, and indeed working a lot with the objects, and yes, thinking about. For me, the talking back, it's not really something I do consciously, where I'm thinking about is that what kind of happens in the process. It's not, and evidently I know about. I mainly focus on working, starting from the sound and being able to make a dialogue with sound, where I think that the sound comes from. But it's much more easy for me to look at other people's work and discuss that and say, oh, this is what it is, than when I'm, yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question. I don't think, but yeah.
Last question.
Could you talk a little more about listening and responding? And this feeds into Paul's question about improvisation, but also I think about objects speaking back. But I really like this ontology you have of tuning to the diaphragm, and the way that the computer system a lot of the time, whether it's analog or digital, is doing the listening for you. But then you also have these tuning setups where listening and responding is really key. Do you think that there's also that listening is a key part of this ontology of tuning to diaphragm?
Good question. Yes, it's definitely a big part of my practice, and I think indeed if you use more of the diaphragm, you need to listen more, because otherwise you're running out. If you like with the piano key, you know I've played you. I mean, that's especially in the feedback pieces. You also remark that like you have to wait till the system is reacting. It has to, and especially if you like with the wide shields, when I retune it, there are different sets on the computer, so that the feedback system first has to get into the system again and start to resonate, and then so you have to listen. If you just do it, then it's going wrong. So yes, I think you're right. It's an important part of the system.
Thanks again for amazing examples, yours and others, and for this, as you can hear, well accepted keynote and appreciated. So thanks again. So we'll take about 5 minutes to grab some coffees and start again at noon.
Back in the lab, yeah?
Back in the lab, though.